Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Let's talk about Brexit, as we pretty well always do on a daily basis. Sam, you are here to take us through what has happened overnight and today, and the controversy and debate around whether Theresa May is going to move from that position we heard in the headlines about making sure that the UK leaves a customs union in order to strike those free trade deals.
So as part of the final stages of the negotiation with Brussels, what they're doing is they're trying to work out the conditions of what's called the backstop. Now, the backstop is something demanded by the European Union as an insurance policy to make sure that there's no hard border in Northern Ireland. And it's fiendishly complicated because it requires quite a lot of things staying similar to the way that they are at the moment. And Britain is trying to make sure that there's a backstop that's acceptable both to its own party and to the DUP, its confidence and supply partners in the Commons, and to Brussels. And we've been playing around with different types of arrangement. And the idea that Downing Street came up with is that in the event that things go a bit wrong and we don't get the kind of deal that we want, we would allow the whole of the United Kingdom to stay in effectively a kind of customs union for the duration while we try and work out what to do with Northern Ireland. And the problem is that a lot of Brexiteers in Cabinet and some Remainers are worried that that could be used to effectively keep us, and the European Union keep us, in a customs union without end. Now, we've seen quite a lot of dramatic developments on this in the last 24 hours. Yesterday, at least 6 cabinet ministers, to her face, challenged Theresa May and said we can't have a kind of open-ended situation where we stay in all but the customs union. I can't believe it's not the customs union to compare it to the butter for an unlimited amount of time. This morning, Downing Street are trying to claim that we will not, under any circumstances, be in a customs union without end. But what they can't do is give a date which will be legally binding, at which point the backstop would expire. That, in many ways, is what many Brexiteers want. And without that, I think this row will rumble on. Right,
well, let's talk to Conservative MP and keen Brexiteer Andrew Bridgen. He joins us now from Leicester. If you heard that, are you reassured by what Downing Street is saying, that there's an expectation of a backstop ending by December 2021?
No, not at all. It does feel as if we're going to be trapped in a trap, not a backstop. And I think the requirement for a backstop ignores the clear political reality around this issue of the Irish border. There's absolutely no way, however we leave the European Union, even if it's WTO or no deal as people call it, the UK will not enforce a hard border on the island of Ireland. The Republic of Ireland will never enforce a hard border on the island of Ireland. And neither the UK nor the Republic of Ireland will allow the EU to enforce a hard border on the island of Ireland. So the only answer is to get on and find those technical solutions which don't require any infrastructure to solve this issue, so we can move to the Super Canada free trade deal and include Northern Ireland, because hiving off Northern Ireland away from the rest of the UK, that's not acceptable to the Conservative and Unionist Party either.
So, Toby, what's the way through?
Well, I'm not sure that what Andrew just proposed is the way through. I mean, the difficulty of what he proposed is that if there has to be continuing regulatory alignment between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland to avoid a hard border between the two, then it's hard to see how a UK outside the customs union with the EU could negotiate trade deals that applied to the whole of the United Kingdom, but which didn't have to comply with that regulatory alignment, which Northern Ireland would be obliged to comply with. So I don't see that solution working.
Right, but do you believe, number 10, do you think that position will hold, that Theresa May will have a time limit to being part of a customs union or whatever they want to call it, a temporary customs arrangement?
I think they'll probably agree some language to fudge that, so it's suitably unclear whether in fact it's time limited or not and who has to consent to our leaving this makeshift temporary customs union. So whether that fudge will satisfy all parties remains to be seen. But I think she will, if she can, make more compromises to secure a deal and try and get that deal through Parliament.
Right, and of course this is all being talked about in the event of there not being a super-duper wide-ranging trade deal, just to remind viewers. Andrew Bridgen, on that basis, do you also worry that Theresa May is going to have to further soften her stance? Really, and we've just seen and hear there from Andrea Leadsom, who's one of those members of the Cabinet, who I think is probably wobbling slightly in terms of her support for the Prime Minister. Do you agree, Andrew, on that?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question. Someone was speaking over.
Yeah, I know someone was speaking over you. Andrea Leadsom was speaking over you. Do you think that this is going to be unacceptable to a number of cabinet ministers if there is not a time limit on the backstop?
Well, if it's not, it certainly should be. And also, I mean, we're then banking on the EU giving us something better when we'll have given all our leverage away, because we'll have signed the withdrawal agreement, authorised the payment of £39 billion of UK taxpayers' money. It's difficult to see how we're going to get a better deal out of the European Union later if we can't get a deal now while the money's on the table, in which case the money's got to come off the table.
Right. Which cabinet ministers do you expect and do you feel should resign if there is a further softening as you see it?
Well, it's in our manifesto that we're coming out of the customs union, the single market, the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. We've seen those red lines, being generous, blurred a lot by the Prime Minister. I would think if we're stopping in the customs union on an open-ended ticket, you would think that there wouldn't be any Brexiteers left in the cabinet, and that would cause a problem for Theresa May.
All right, well, let's hear from one of them properly. You were talking that you heard Andrea Leadsom there. Let's listen to what she had to say when she was stopped in the street today.
We're at the final stages of a really complicated negotiation, and I do think we have to give the Prime Minister the opportunity to be able to do a good deal for the United Kingdom, something that she's absolutely determined to do. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Sam, convinced? I mean, if there's Esther McVey, there's Penny Mordaunt, there's Liam Fox, and there's Andrea Leadsom, Leader of the House. How damaging would it be if they did walk?
I think Theresa May could survive the departure of some, possibly all of those. I mean, I think the key figures in the cabinet look a lot more like Jeremy Hunt, the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, the Brexit Secretary, Michael Gove, the Environment Secretary, and Sajid Javid, the Home Secretary. I think they're, as it were, swing voters, people with who supported Brexit or have quite Brexity instincts, who are trying to make sure that the deal is as sellable to the largest part of the party as possible. But as some of them know, just think through what the alternative is, what the kind of Brexiteer path and the consequences of that is. If you put a hard time limit on the backstop, there will be no backstop because it isn't an insurance policy. If there is no backstop, there is no withdrawal agreement, that thing that we've negotiated 90% of. And if there's no withdrawal agreement, then we're in a situation that takes us far closer to no deal than we have been. And we've basically said that for all the negotiations that we've done over the last year, do you know what? Actually, forget that. We're going to start again. That would be quite a higher wire thing to do at this late stage. And that's why, frankly, people haven't completely jumped and are still holding back despite their concerns.
And do you think they'll stay? I mean, watching this, the two of you, from the outside to some extent, what are your thoughts about where we are? Because we've been in this crunch moment a lot of times. Does this feel any different?
So the first thing I would say is go back to the Eurozone crisis and, you know, all the decisions were last minute when nobody thought they were going to happen. Everything was always taken to the wire. The other thing is when I listen to all of this, and clearly you're political writers, this is a show about politics, your audience will be very well informed about politics. But I imagine most people look at all this and 6-7% of people don't even know what the Chequers deal is, let alone what a backstop is. You know, most people are worried about paying their mortgages, whether their children will get on the housing ladder, you know, how much university fees have gone up. That's what most people... I just find it just bewildering, this sort of... I mean, I was looking at a flowchart of all things, of all the various outcomes over the next 6 months. And it was like, I looked at it, it made my brain melt. And it was only one part of it, by the way.
Except if some of the pundits are right, we could be seeing a second referendum, or we could end up in another general election. Then that would be important to people, wouldn't it?
I mean, I think, as was just said, I think one of the worst things about Brexit, to my mind, is that we're talking about it we've been talking about it incessantly for a year and a half now, rather than addressing some of the problems with our infrastructure in this country, with the rates of poverty in this country, child poverty especially. And as much as I was opposed to Brexit myself, I mean, going through that process of another referendum now, when I don't think the result would be any different. I think you'd stir up great anger at the fact that the original referendum was ignored. I mean, I wish we were talking about something else now.
Well, we all sort of laughed, didn't we, when like France and Ireland had to have a second referendum because the population didn't vote correctly the first time. So we'll keep going until they do vote correctly.
It stirred up anger in those countries.
Nicola Sturgeon has now endorsed the people's vote and said she would like to see a second EU referendum. It's like, well, if there is then another vote on whether Scotland should become independent and Scotland votes to come out of the Union, should we therefore have a second vote to see if they really mean it? And how's she going to argue against that, given that she said we need a second vote to see if we really mean that we want to come out of this union?
I support a people's vote. I didn't start that way, but that's where I am now, because I just don't see any options getting through Parliament. I think you're absolutely right when you make the point. People are just worried about if they're going to be, they've got a school place for their child, a hospital bed for their mum. I mean, you know, the idea that we are going to make people poorer because of a decision that we make, you have
well,
to...
on that point,
must have the opportunity to relook at every decision
on that
you
point
make.
that you are worried that it might make people poorer is a good time to bring in the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, not in person, I have to say, because he's in Bali, but it is linked inextricably, Brexit, he feels, with the budget. And he had this to say about what might come out of Brexit.
The OBR's forecast, which is the basis of our current projections for the economy and our fiscal position, is based on pretty much a midway point between no deal at all and an EEA solution. The deal that we're trying to negotiate with the European Union now represents an improvement from the point of view of the British economy over that midpoint, and therefore should deliver us an upside in the form of higher economic growth and better outcomes than were otherwise anticipated. Well,
Sam, what do you make of that politically? I mean, is he offering here Tory MPs the chance to back the deal that the government has put forward, the Chequers deal as Louise called it, because that might end austerity and there will be a Brexit dividend? That's exactly what he's doing. He's trying to present a carrot before MPs as they try and make up their mind whether to vote for Theresa May's deal. Now, Brexiteers will call this Project Fear. There's some logic in the numbers, in the way that he talks about the numbers. If you look at the kind of Chequers deal that the government wants to get through, that's not that far off the kind of economic relationship that we have at the moment in many ways. That would be good for the public finances, or not too disastrous for the public finances. There would be a lot less risk, so he could reduce the headroom that he needs in the budget. That'll free up billions and billions and billions for next year's spending review. And that's the carrot that he's trying to dangle. Well, Andrew Bridgen, is that enough of a carrot for you, that there would be this money around to spend on all the other things aside from Brexit? Schools, hospitals?
Well, now, of course, those are tremendously important to the electorate, and I agree there's an amount of Brexit fatigue out there, but let's be clear, the way in which we leave the European Union, which is looking increasingly as if it's going to affect the way we can do trade in the future with the rest of the world, is going to be the biggest political decision, certainly of my political career and probably our lifetimes. It's important that we get it right. But if we can't do free trade deals around the world, where even the EU clearly admit that 95% of the world's economic growth over the next 20 years is going to come from outside the European Union, then we are missing out on the main economic benefit of Brexit. And the Chancellor's offering a very short-term gain in the next 12 months against the long-term economic prospects for the UK, and I think we've got to look a bit longer than that and look about where our country can be in 5 and 10 years' time. And I know when you're in a 4 or 5 year parliament, it's very difficult for politicians to do that. But I think for our country and for our party, I think it's very important that we do. But
Louise, would a closer relationship with the EU in the way Philip Hammond would like to see it actually bring higher economic growth in your mind and help end austerity, which the government says, whether it can actually deliver it, is going to do?
So it's quite interesting because we have everybody, I think, is focusing on the short-term economic hit from whatever gets discussed, but the long-term economic potential is far more uncertain. I mean, the thing about statistics and economics in particular is you can always prove whatever you want to prove. So this week we had GDP figures out, and I looked at my phone and Bloomberg flashed them, fastest growth in 2 years. I then read the Evening Standard on the way home, slowest growth, basically the economy's stalling. That's because they looked at just the August figure alone. So, it's far, far more complicated than just saying it's black or white. I mean, again, I was reading a piece of research about Brexit and the various things, and there's great, it says, the estimates, this is a piece of UBS research, the estimates are highly sensitive to the assumptions made. Many other factors are pure guesswork. Long term, we don't know. And long term, to be fair, it is true there was economic opportunity all over the world, far less so in the EU.
I mean, Andrew, your colleague Andrea Jenkins, Conservative MP, has tweeted today that if the Prime Minister and government continue to push for the UK to remain in the customs union partnership, then we need a new leader. The 48 letters must go in. That's the number that's needed to trigger a leadership contest. This is an ultimate betrayal of the 17.4 million people who voted to leave. #Chuck Checkers. Do you agree with her?
Well, of course I do, and I'm on the record. I actually put my letter of no confidence in on the Prime Minister publicly back in July, and I think we will get to the 48 letters. We can't carry on like this. The negotiations.
But you've said that. When are you going to get to this?
Well, I've done my bit, and I would urge colleagues who haven't put letters in, who are, I think, will be absolutely shocked if we're stopping in a customs union, which is in breach of our manifesto pledges we only stood on last year, that they should put the letters in, and let's test the Prime Minister's popularity with the party.
Right, but actually, you've been saying this for months, Andrew. We can't go on like this, we can't go on like this, and actually you are going on exactly like this because there aren't enough Tory MPs who back you or Andrea Jenkins. I mean, who is it you're waiting for to put those letters in?
I think colleagues have been holding back.
Which ones?
Feeling
Jacob
that it will be
Rees-Mogg?
been indulgence to have a leadership challenge. I don't think it's going to be a coronation if we have a leadership challenge. I think it's going to be a hard-fought election, and I think they wanted to avoid that. But I think if it becomes clear that we're stopping in a customs union, colleagues will come to the conclusion, I think belatedly, we should have had this vote before summer recess and dealt with it, but now we'll have to deal with it now, and I think it's coming to a head this week.
This week you think it's going to come to a head. So you think those numbers will go in, the number of letters will go in, and there will be a confidence vote in Theresa May?
Well, it's clear that, I mean, colleagues are telling me that a lot of Brexiteers are being invited for dinner and lunch at number 10 next week, so I guess there's bad news on the way.
Toby?
I think the dilemma that many backbench Eurosceptics are facing is, if we do force a vote of confidence in the Prime Minister and she loses, she resigns, in that febrile and uncertain environment, a general election could be triggered, and in that general election, Jeremy Corbyn could end up winning. So if they're faced with a choice between Checkers minus, or a Corbyn-led government, that's a tough choice, even for bug-eyed Eurosceptics like Andrew.
Right. Sam?
For months we've been waiting for hardcore Brexiteers to make a move on the Prime Minister, and they haven't. But there's another problem, and there's a problem coming down the track really quickly, and it's the DUP. Now, the DUP's language on what they think of Theresa May's Brexit deal has shifted. We've been reporting it incrementally, but there's no doubt there is a big change from where we were even 2 weeks ago, and it looks like they can't support key elements, including this backstop. What's the consequence? They're now talking about voting down the budget. It might be that it's not the Brexiteers who ever end up ousting Theresa May. It might be that it's the DUP, because if she doesn't have the votes for a budget and a budget falls, God knows where we are in British politics.
But it would then be much easier for her to lead the Conservative Party into a general election than if she was defeated by members of her own party.
Which still requires a vote,
Siobhan?
and that would require Tories to vote for.
I just think anybody who is not in a political party, or people who are, must be looking at this and thinking, what the hell is going on? A local health centre in my constituency got pulled the other day because the lift finance company wouldn't give the money because they're too worried about what's going to happen about Brexit.
So why doesn't Labour back Theresa May's plan? Then the deal will go through, and then you can move on to other things.
Well, because some of us, no, I was going to use a royal we there, I mean, some of us believe that this is such a mess and the deal looks so bad that actually people deserve another chance.
So you sympathise with Andrew Bridgen then?
I don't sympathise with him at all. I think the Prime Minister should say, look, it's difficult, this is what I've come up with. Do you, the British people, actually think this is what you want?
All right, final word, Andrew Bridgen. Toby Young called you a bug-eyed Eurosceptic. How would you describe yourself?
Well,
You've been called worse.
I led Leave for the East. I've called worse. I led Leave for the East Midlands. The East Midlands voted 59-41 to leave. My own seat of North West Leicestershire voted 61-39 to leave. I completely support. I started out being a rebel. I was pushing for a referendum. We had a referendum. Leave won. Theresa May came in and she said the Brexit means Brexit, Lancaster House speech, I'm completely behind her. I remain behind Lancaster House. It's just very unfortunate for me and my electorate and the people of the East Midlands who voted to leave and still want to leave the European Union that the Prime Minister doesn't stand behind her own Mansion House speech.
Toby?
Andrew, just a quick question. If the choice was between a deal which kept us in the customs union or a Jeremy Corbyn-led government, which would be the worst outcome as far as you're concerned?
The worst would be Jeremy Corbyn, but I don't see them as their mutually exclusive.
All right, we're going to finish it there. Andrew?
We can avoid having Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. I don't think the people are that desperate to vote for that.
All right. We'll say goodbye to you, Andrew. Thank you very much. The government has further outlined what could happen if we leave the EU without a deal as part of its contingency planning. Eurostar might be suspended and tickets no longer valid, and the electricity supply to Northern Ireland could be disrupted. Our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, reports.
The picture's building, and it's not pretty. Of course, it may never happen, but Brexit with no deal could mean disruption to travel, trade, business. Warning notices are pouring out of government now, 106 and counting. The latest, could we see this in Northern Ireland? There'd have to be action to protect energy supplies, keep the lights on if EU rules suddenly fall away. Could the Eurostar keep running? International rail services run on EU-wide agreements. They'd have to be replaced, maybe quickly. And what about trade? Not just with the EU, but the 40-odd countries Britain buys and sells to as part of the Union. No deal with them could mean new tariffs and checks on business covering around 12% of UK trade around the world. The Brexit Secretary is looking on the bright side.
If the EU don't match our ambition and pragmatism, if we get that unlikely no-deal scenario, which we don't want, we'll still be able to manage the risks and make sure we can make a success of Brexit.
But next week, Theresa May meets her cabinet with an urgent problem. Some ministers fear ending up bound by EU customs rules, unable to strike trade deals after any transition time if no Brexit trade deals ready by then. Dominic Raab is one who wants a clear end date.
What we cannot do is see the United Kingdom locked in via the back door to a customs union arrangement which would leave us in an indefinite limbo. That would not be leaving the EU.
No more resignations yet.
And I do think we have to give the Prime Minister the opportunity to be able to do a good deal for the United Kingdom, something that she's absolutely determined to do.
Brexiteer ministers are staying loyal, at least in public. The Democratic Unionists Mrs May relies on aren't holding back. Why? All sides say no hard Irish border after Brexit, but some checks between Northern Ireland and the mainland are on the table. So the DUP is threatening to defeat the government and turn on Mrs May.
The one red line in relation to the United Kingdom is one that we will stand by come what may. It's very important for us that we keep the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom, but also the economic integrity.
For Labour, the PM's troubles are an easy target.
Well, there's obviously two sets of negotiations going on. On the one hand, the government is negotiating in Brussels. On the other hand, the government is negotiating around the cabinet table. And this has got to stop. The public interest has got to come first. And this division at the heart of the government has been the cause of so much of the problem.
Even if that's true, the Prime Minister may well end up relying on pro-EU Labour MPs to get any deal through. For now, she's trying to bridge the splits on her own side. Downing Street's saying she'll never allow Britain to remain trapped permanently by EU customs rule. She needs a deal she can present as temporary. Brussels is looking for a deal they can say will last as long as it needs to before a fully fledged trade deal is in place. The next meeting of EU leaders comes next week. Breaking this deadlock will surely take longer, if it can be broken at all. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
The Chancellor has opened the door to tax rises, saying the government may have to raise a little more tax to pay for the health service. Philip Hammond has also told the BBC that Britain could see an economic boost if it successfully negotiates a Brexit deal with the EU. Our economics editor Kamal Ahmed spoke to him in Bali, where finance ministers from around the world are meeting.
Hello, Chancellor. Very good to see you. Yeah, very well indeed. Just over 2 weeks' time, you delivered the budget. You've got high levels of debt. You've got the risk to the economy from the Brexit process, and you have a Prime Minister saying that austerity is over. Can I start with that austerity issue? When the Prime Minister says austerity is over, what does that mean?
Well, what the Prime Minister said was when we get a good deal from our negotiations with the European Union, then as well as being able to continue reducing our debt, which is very important for the future, we will also be able to provide more support for our public services. Look, we've made a very large commitment to the NHS because we know that it is the British people's #1 priority. By 23-24, we'll be putting an extra £20.5 billion a year into the NHS in England alone in real terms, and that has to be paid for.
Does that commitment to the NHS trump any manifesto promise to cut taxes?
But we've said that we may have to raise a little more tax in order to support the NHS and deliver on our pledge. But there are many ways in which we can do that, and it's important that we do it in a way that minimises any negative impact on the economy, minimises the effect on people. I am a low-tax Tory.
Chancellor, on Brexit, some more positive noises possibly from the government in Britain and also the rest of the European Union. Are you feeling more optimistic that there will be a Brexit deal? And if there is, could there be some form of dividend for the UK economy?
What has happened over the last week, 10 days, is that there's been a measurable change in pace. There's a real sense now of engagement from both sides, of shared enterprise in trying to solve a problem rather than posturing towards each other. So if we are able to get to a good deal for Britain as we leave the European Union, I believe there will be a dividend, a deal dividend for us of higher economic growth and better outcomes than were otherwise anticipated.
Whatever the Chancellor's positive words on a deal dividend, what is clear is that austerity is still with us today. Public service cuts, benefit cuts are ahead. The Chancellor calls himself a low-tax Tory, but he's left the door open to tax rises in the budget in 2 weeks' time. Kamal Ahmed, BBC News, Bali.